Hello and you're very welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler, in association with Square. Square can help your business needs from online ordering and menu management to payments. Visit square.com for more. Now, banks screwing up our ATMs, telephone firms overcharging us, health authorities using ancient Windows PCs. Is Ireland just not very good at IT for basic citizen services? Well, here to discuss this with me, Sarah Collins, business journalist with the Irish Independent. Sarah, were you one of those who was queuing for your free, interest-free money at ATMs last month?
I wasn't, for two reasons. One, I don't believe in free money. And two, I'm really old and I wasn't looking at Twitter, so I didn't know what was happening.
Do you have a Revolut?
I do have a Revolut.
And did you hear this going on in the grapevine?
I heard something, but I trust nobody and nothing, like a good journalist. And so, no, I didn't. I also know how much money I had in my accounts. There was no point in transferring anything.
Right, okay. So you weren't tempted by that idea of an interest-free loan. You knew you'd have to pay it back, but you must have had a sense that Bank of Ireland wouldn't have had the chutzpah to actually penalise you for it.
I didn't have that sense, I must say. I would be quite low-risk kind of person, risk-averse.
That's what we like on this podcast. But so, I mean, I went on several rants about this at the time. I wrote pieces, I did a bit of broadcast, and I'm still a little bit stuck. I have this thing in my head now about what happened, about what it says about Ireland's IT infrastructure. Do you get that sense as well?
I 100% get that sense. And without revealing who I bank with, it's not the first error I've heard of.
Yeah.
Not the first error I've heard of with this particular bank. But are you clear what happened?
So we're still not completely clear what happened. Now, at the time, the most I could get out of them was it wasn't an upgrade to the network. It wasn't a hack. So it was something else, to do with Bank of Ireland's famous IT system. And I really don't have any hesitation about using that snark, in my voice when it comes to Bank of Ireland. I mean, this isn't the first time. This isn't Bank of Ireland's first rodeo. So in June, for example, it had to open branches late on a Friday night and on Saturday because its IT systems went down. Right, it was payday for a lot of people. Last year, it was fined a record €24.5 million for basically what the central bank said was an utter shambles for over 10 years. IT failures is how they described it, and it's kind of made Ireland into a laughing stock. I mean, globally. So I remember looking at the coverage at the time, the BBC, Reuters, CNN, AP. Now, you have a very cultured journalistic heritage. Did you see any of that? Did you see any of that kind of laughing at us?
I don't know if it was laughing at us, but it was certainly reported absolutely everywhere. I saw it on small tech blogs. I saw it on major daily newspapers. And it did I think Irish people would tend to be a bit more critical of ourselves than other people are of us. And maybe other banks are saying there, but for the grace of God, go I. But there does, like the title of this particular podcast, there does seem to be something uniquely wrong with Irish banks' IT systems. I mean, whether it's an underinvestment, whether it's, not a lack of IT knowledge, like what's your sense of what was behind it?
So just talking to people who work in banks at senior levels, the best explanation I've had is that banking tech is quite difficult. It's quite complicated. It's a big enterprise. Over decades, they have to try and bolt on new systems for new services. Like they're pillars, utilities of the community. That's fair enough. We all understand that. You can't just swap something in and something out then every time something comes to some new smartphone service. So what they've done is they've tried to add additional layers to try and diversify, try and add to the services they've had. And if managed properly, that can be okay. That's what banks all over the world have to do. But as a central bank kind of pointed out in its report last year, Bank of Ireland, and I am really focused on Bank of Ireland here, they kind of use the equivalent of sticky tape. They just haven't got it right. I mean, I use an iPad Pro a lot instead of a laptop. And when I open the Bank of Ireland app on the iPad, it's sideways. I mean, I have to do that every time I'm using the app. So there is a kind of particular problem, I think, with that bank. But there's one thing that we in Ireland hate, and that's other people like laughing at us. If this had happened and it had just stayed within the Irish media, I think we would have just chalked it down to, oh, there it goes again, okay? But if I open the BBC News, particularly the Brits, not the Brits all finding out that we're, cack-handed, at our IT, and it's such a basic thing as banking as well. I think that's when the sort of the shame comes in,
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And not to just heap on Bank of Ireland, like the central bank had its own issue last week. With an issue that it said could affect borrowers. It was a GDPR-related issue, it seems to have been.
Yeah, so, I mean, as if this couldn't get ludicrous enough, just as the central bank was urged by Minister of Finance and others to investigate Bank of Ireland, the central bank then announces that it has had an IT failure. Maybe an IT failure is too strong. It had a problem. They called it an archiving error, which essentially exposed about 20,000 borrowers, their credit histories, to lenders, insurers, people who would judge their credit rating, who shouldn't have seen that information. Now, the thing is here, this is not something the central bank itself discovered. It was a member of the public alerted them to it. So technically, it's a data breach. Now, in and of itself, it's maybe not the worst IT, failure you could have, but coming so soon after the Bank of Ireland, this is supposed to be the judge. This is the arbiter, and they're now going to Bank of Ireland, with this in their hands. So, are we being a bit too hard on the banks here?
No. I mean, I've lived abroad for many years, and I lived in Belgium, and the Belgian banks are not known as being the best or the most, innovative. And yet, for years in Belgium, I've been able to, if I want to receive a payment from someone, scan a QR code on my Belgian banking app, no other app needed, and request payment from someone, or they can do the same, or scan on someone's phone and pay someone through a QR code using your own bank account, no intermediary needed.
So you don't need then a Revolut.
You don't need a Revolut. If you go to Belgium, and I went there recently and I was like, can I pay you by Revolut? They said, what's that? In the Netherlands, they use a similar system. It's called Tikkie, but it's not, you don't need that particular app, and you just send people payment requests by WhatsApp. And they don't need to have this Tikkie app. It just takes them, you click the link, it takes them to their own banking provider, and they pay.
Yeah.
Doing a bank transfer, but it's an immediate transfer.
The only time I ever feel pride coming from Ireland or Europe is when I go to the States and I go into a shop and they all but have that old credit card machine.
There's not even chip and pin.
Yeah, I mean barely. They barely have chip and pin, and half of them don't take tap to pay and all that sort of stuff. But we've talking about banks, but there are other pillars. There are other parts of Ireland's infrastructure, and I suppose it would be remiss. We need to talk about the HSE. We need to talk about the kind of tech that they use here. Now, everybody knows they had a ransomware attack in 2021, and you can't really totally protect against that. That's going to happen to a lot of different organisations, and we know that there was over 100 million euro of damage there done. But there are other bits of the HSE which I've always been a little bit baffled by. I remember reporting a couple of years ago about the number of Windows 95 and 98 and old Windows machines that they still used.
Yeah.
Now, these would be machines that have been literally more than a decade out of date. Now, the HSE would say these are attached to big machines, X-ray machines, things that don't go anywhere near the internet, and these machines aren't updated to take Windows 11 or modern systems. But let me read you something that the HSE's then head of digital transformation in January, is a guy called Professor Martin Curley. He's kind of famous in Irish IT circles. He's worked for the HSE since 2018. And this January, he resigned as HSE's head of digital transformation. And this is what he wrote on LinkedIn. He said he compared the job to scaling Mount Everest. He said, "We have called off this particular ascent on Everest. Bad weather prognosis and supply chain and funding blockages. We could still succeed, but there would be too many casualties, including me." Now, like when your head of digital transformation writes on LinkedIn, which is a pretty anemic, backslapping social media platform, that it's like Everest and that there's going to be casualties. You know?
That's pretty excoriating.
It's a bit excoriating.
I think even anybody who has ever gone into the Irish health system, into a GP, into the hospital for any reason, minor or major, will know that at every step of the process, there's a new person inputting your details in a system that I suspect is not connected to any other system within that hospital.
Yeah.
So the same thing happens time and time and time again, whereas in other countries, like in France, for instance, it's so seamless. Now, the problem is it's all done with ID cards. It's based a lot of the time on your national security number, and Irish people hate ID cards, and we've had this debate in the past. But there must be other ways, either to link it to your PPS number without having to have a photo ID, that you could somehow link so that you're not going to 5 different doctors in the one day and they all ask you the same questions. Doctors shouldn't be administrators.
No.
They shouldn't have to be. There must be a better way.
Yeah, and then you run into the problem, which I ran into last month, which was I was having issues. I needed to see a doctor. It wasn't urgent. I wasn't about to die. Wasn't feeling well over a series of weeks. So I tried to see a GP, and the waiting list in my GP clinic, 6 doctors, is 5 weeks.
Wow.
Okay? That's quite long. So I ended up doing one of these tele doctors, but I realized that there was no way for me to parlay or transfer my health history to that other doctor for exactly the reason you're talking about. But I ended up going for an MRI, okay, on my brain.
Yeah.
Went in, got the MRI, fine.
Did they find anything in there?
No, nothing at all. It's all vacant, Sarah.
A monkey, chocolate symbols.
Yeah, exactly, something like that. But they said as part of the MRI that they were going to give me images of my brain. Now, look, just tell me if I'm healthy or not. I don't care. But anyway, so I came out from the MRI, went to reception. The reception was there, proud as punch, beaming at me and said, "Here are your images." And she handed me a CD-ROM.
I'm sorry, Phil.
Right? A CD-ROM. And I literally took it and I went, is there something else with this? Or is it, yeah, no, you can put that in your computer. I just didn't have the heart to go into it. But, you know, this is what we're talking about. And I spoke to somebody who knows a little bit about the medical IT infrastructure in this country, and she told me that there are large chunks of the infrastructure that would still work off, you know, or DVDs and CD-ROMs, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And it costs a lot of money maybe to upgrade it. And then you're looking at maybe migrating that to the cloud, and then you may be more exposed to hacks or ransomware attacks.
This is the problem. But the other thing about hacks is often it's human error, isn't it? And I think the HSE did say that this particular ransomware, the attack during COVID was a human error. Somebody clicked on a link. Yep. And it's really hard to guard against that. And as you say, the more you put systems online, the more you're vulnerable to that.
So it's a vicious circle, because I don't know if you get these spam texts
all the time,
emails purporting to be from any bank,
on
any mobile or telecoms operator. Now, one of the reasons that they can get into existing text conversations that you've had with your bank, or like marketing discussions, is because of the way SMS is set up. The telecom companies for years have, as far as I'm concerned, completely dropped the ball on that. They could have been motivated into doing more. Now, they have started recently to do more on that, and there is some hope that they'll be able to crack down a bit more. So you get one of these texts, you tap on it, or you click on it if it's an email. That then triggers a whole ransomware thing, and that's how the whole virtuous circle happens.
And I mean, Irish telecoms companies haven't been immune to this kind of, to being chided for being lax on IT systems.
So I mean, other than not cracking down, for example, on smishing or phishing attacks, I think most listeners to this podcast would be familiar, either themselves or with a family member, of being overcharged, of someone passing away in the family, and it's difficult to close down an account, or they keep getting bills. So this year, for example, just 3 months ago, Air were charged €2.5 million for overcharging 76,000 customers over several years. And that's not particularly unusual. The size of the fine is unusual. But in June, 3 was sanctioned by Comreg Telecom's operator for overcharging 25,000 customers. Virgin Media, a couple of years ago, got a big fine. They had to refund over 100,000 customers for overcharging them for 6 years. Now, you kind of look at that as a pattern and you think, like, that's a lot of ordinary utilities in our lives that are mucking up.
It is. And the banks did the same. I mean, there are several banks who have been fined for overcharging, whether it's tracker mortgage customers or recently, to name they who should not be named again, but Bank of Ireland. I
think AIB got
it was AIB. It was
AIB got a huge tracker fine.
Yeah, they all of the banks, the pillar banks certainly got tracker fines. It wasn't just Bank of Ireland. It was PTSB as well, KBC, the ones who have exited. It does seem to pervade every single part of our society. And it's ironic because we've so many tech companies here. So what is the issue? Is it that they don't have the budget for hiring tech staff? They don't have the budget for digital transformation or whatever you call it? Or they don't put the priority themselves on it?
It's a couple of things. And this is where you get into the realm of kind of cultural speculation and trying to assign cultural values to us as a people and how hard we work at, or what our strengths are. You'll often hear people say that in the tech sector, for example, that the strength of Irish people is in sales and marketing, which is why they generally get to the top of those parts of the business, not necessarily to the top of research and development, to the very top. But I think it's a combination of a few things. So I mentioned Professor Martin Curley there when he was stepping down from the HSE. And I know I have first-hand knowledge of senior executives who say that they are beating up against a brick wall in some of their organisations. You look at Bank of Ireland, it has spent well over €1 billion. Francis McDonagh, the last CEO, was in charge of a modernisation programme. Miles O'Grady supposedly is continuing that. Instead, what he's seeing is mobs outside ATMs getting interest-free loans. So there is maybe a culture issue here as well as a competence issue. Nobody doubts that Irish people are incredibly competent when they put their mind to something. We absolutely are. I mean, the National Cyber Security Centre, for example, at the time of the HSE hack, had a handful of people working for it, hardly anyone. Now they've kind of put a bit more money in. They've hired more people. I don't know whether you could say that is still something which you would legitimately regard as the National Cyber Security Centre. Like if we really got hit with a nation-state attack from the Russians or the Chinese, really we'd be looking to the Brits or somebody else to come in and try and help us, or an army of outside contractors.
Yeah. Where are we with the National Cybersecurity Strategy? Because there was this big programme put in place, big aims. And as we've been talking about, all of these things about going more online, banks need to upgrade their IT systems, the HSE does, but as they go online, they become more vulnerable. And I've seen statistics showing that healthcare providers are sometimes the number one target for cyber, at least for ransomware attacks. So what is the government doing about it?
Well, there was a new guy who became the head of the National Cybersecurity Centre called Richard Brown, fairly well regarded in IT circles. And we had him on the podcast actually about a year ago, and he has been told to beef up that organisation. It seems to be a fairly slow build-up, though. They issued a report about 6 weeks ago, a progress report, and really mostly what it was things that they're still working on, objectives, getting buy-in from other agencies, things like that. There were a few concrete things that they were able to point to. But look, compared to other European countries, most other European countries, we would still have a very lightweight. And that's not to talk about the professionals of the people involved who are all very well regarded. But in terms of numbers, in terms of resources, we don't really compete with other countries. But that's maybe a defence perspective as well. We've never really seen ourselves as being a country to really invest in defence. And this is kind of cyber defence.
Because we're not a target, I think. I remember years ago, the Estonian government was hit with this massive cyber attack. It was like the mid-2000s. And after that, and they would be quite big on defence given their geographic location. After that, they invested billions in it. Now they're one of the top European countries. Their banks are super IT. And they pride themselves on it. It's a national, symbol. The Swedes and the Danes would be quite good at that as well, but that they would have been traditionally anyway more IT forward. But what is stopping us? Do you think it's just that sense of we're not a target, we don't need to?
Maybe. It's also our particular stage of industrialisation, I think. I mean, if you look at Ireland up until maybe the early 80s, mid-80s, way behind most other countries industrially, very, very dependent on a handful of sectors. You might argue we are now, again, pharmaceutical and tech. By and large, we've taken a little bit more control over our own fortunes there. So maybe that is. I mean, wasn't there a Russian ship that was off the coast of Galway there a couple of months ago?
Yep.
And I think our sort of attitude was, hey, clear off. I think that was it.
The fishermen.
Yeah,
the fishermen got them to clear off.
I mean, that's our last line of defence. So anyway, I guess taking it from this podcast, Sarah, I think our message is if you want a really well-run, really safe fighting country, move to Estonia, right?
Yes.
So anyway, okay, Sarah Collins, business journalist in the Irish Independent, thanks very much for joining us. And thank you for listening and for watching. Gavin Hennessy was on sound, Conan Doherty was on video, and Mary Carroll produced this. From me, Adrian Weckler, you've been watching the Big Tech Show in association with Square, and we'll talk to you at the same time next week. Bye-bye.